Today on Granworks, I install reclaimed Saltillo tile from beginning to end. Stay tuned. I had a strip of bare concrete slab in front of my theater that needed to be retiled. The rest of the hall is tiled with Saltillo tiles, and I happen to have a large selection of recovered tiles from when I deconstructed my living room a few years back. I'm more into deconstruction than demolition when possible. One downside for reusing old tiles is that they all have a notable amount of mortar still stuck to them that had to be ground off first. I say that all of them have mortar because there's a bit of a selection bias going on. All of the tiles with mortar that was not loosely attached to the concrete slab ended up being destroyed when trying to remove them. So by necessity, the only tiles that survived the process were ones with the mortar still stuck on. Now some of the tiles had mortar in the grooved pattern made by a square notch trowel. I attacked those first with a masonry chisel just to knock down the high spots. That only goes so far, and so I eventually need to grind down what's left regardless. When I first tried this with a regular grinding wheel, the amount of dust it kicked up was almost unbelievably staggering. Everything within 10 feet of the tile was covered with dust, and some of the dust made it well beyond that. But since then, I discovered the Buddie shroud for my angle grinder, and well, rarely do you find a product that works as brilliantly as this one does. Hook it up to a decent shot back, and it not only reduces the dust, but it eliminates it. It's the difference between a stupefying cloud of dust and so little dust that you could probably get away with using no dust mask at all. Really, it's an amazing product. Anyway, this video is sped up a bit, but it takes roughly 2 minutes to grind on one tile. Now, after realizing it took the exact same 2 minutes to do a tile with the back completely covered with mortar, and thus no way to prep it with a masonry chisel, I decided to skip the chisel step thereafter for all the tiles, and just use a grinder exclusively. Why do more work when it takes the same amount of time to finish it in the end anyway? I did still use a chisel on a few cases where there's a grout still stuck to the tile. But every now and then, this will cause the tile to crack. In those cases, I just ground down the good side and later cut the tile off right at that point to use as a partial tile. Thus, little or no waste. The space requires more partial tiles than full ones, and so I needed to do a bit of tile cutting. I tested out the option of using an angle grinder first, but passed after the experiment. More on that later. I bought a $99 wet saw from Home Depot. Yes, there is a model that is slightly cheaper both at Home Depot and Harbor Freight, but this one came with a diamond blade for the price, and the cheaper ones required buying a $30 blade. In the end, this ended up being the cheapest one to just get started. So how good is it? Well, are you used to the professional grade tile saws? Maybe you've exclusively rented a higher end saw and have never used a cheap one? If so, then you'd hate this saw with a passion. It's much slower, bogs down with anything more than a tiny bit of pressure, and is notably less accurate with its fence. But if you don't have such experience and you want to spend as little money as possible on cutting tile, then this actually works okay. Just take it slow, make some test cuts to calibrate the fence, and it'll cut through whatever you have, providing that you have the patience. One downside to cutting Saltillo is that the red clay dust from the cut mixes with the water and creates a pretty decent dye. I was unable to fully clean this saw after I was done since the clay dye permanently stained some bits of it. Go figure. I could use the tile saw for all the rectangular partial pieces, but there was one piece that needed to be an L or a P or something like that to go around a corner. I used my angle grinder with a diamond cutoff wheel to cut out that piece. Compared to my cheap tile saw, the angle grinder actually feels like it has a lot more power. I could likely do all the cuts much faster with it than on the Freehand than on the tile saw. But man, does it kick up a lot of dust. I didn't want to deal with that with the rest of the pieces. And also, I found myself unable to get a truly straight line when doing a freehand. Finally, the edge isn't quite as fine with the angle grinder as it is with the tile saw. There are chips taken out of top and bottom. Maybe it's because I couldn't keep the wheel perfectly square to the piece. It all worked out in the end for this one piece at least. I made sure to dry fit everything before starting since installing the Saltillo is kinda fiddly work, and I didn't think I had enough time to cut and install it all at once. One important thing to note about Saltillo tile, its clay content makes it an extremely thirsty tile. So much so that it will naturally try to suck out all the moisture from your mortar during installation, leaving a very dry mortar that does a terrible job of curing. It also means that any mortar or grout that touches the tile will almost immediately stain the tile permanently. That's why the first essential step is to soak the tiles in water, preferably overnight, but at a minimum for some amount of time before installation. This was a relatively small project, and so my goal was to just reuse leftover fortified thin set from a previous project. I started by pouring in a tiny bit of water into my bucket, and then emptied the rest of the bag into it. I then inexplicably assumed that there wasn't enough water and added more. That was a mistake. It became very quickly clear that my water to thin set ratio wasn't even close to correct. And while you can always add more water later, you can't remove any. Ugh. Well, I did have an unopened bag of slightly different fortified thin set that I wasn't planning on using for this project. But it looks like I left myself no choice. I'm not a big fan of combining two different types of thin set, but well, let me reiterate that I had stupidly left myself no choice in the matter. With the added thin set, I was able to stir it to much smoother consistency. By the way, you'll notice I'm using a corded drill for this. Experience has taught me that a decent half-inch cordless drill sort of works, just not great. The constant use that mixing mortar requires has a tendency to destroy the batteries. That is, not only does it make the battery go dead pretty quickly, but it'll prevent the battery from charging again, ruining the battery itself. Maybe it's heat related? In any event, if you're going to be mixing thick compounds like this, then a corded drill is likely going to be the cheaper method in the long run when you factor in all of the dead batteries. Okay, the tools I use for laying the tile are as follows. One 5-gallon bucket with the thin set, and then another bucket with water. One 6-inch joint knife for loading on the thick set. A 1/4 inch by 3/8 inch square notch trowel to actually spread out the thin set. A sponge to wipe things down, and then some wood pieces between 3/4 inch and 1 inch wide to clean out the grout lines. I went back and forth on the notch trowel size. The question is if the tiles are considered large format or not. Most resources I found say to use a 1/2 inch square notch with tiles larger than 16 inches wide, and my tiles are 12 inch square. But these are also notably thicker than most typical tiles, and that might factor in too. Finally, some sites do claim that a 1/2 inch square notch should be used even for 12 inch by 12 inch tiles. Those tend to be in the minority though. In the end, I chose the 3/8 inch trowel mostly because I already had it, and I was planning on back buttering the tiles anyway. A 1/2 inch trowel likely would have worked out just fine, but so did the 3/8 inch one. My procedure was to just dump out a bunch of thin set with a 6-inch joint knife and then even it out using the notch trowel. Each tile then gets its own individual helping of thin set as I back butter it. I do this because the Saltillo tiles aren't smooth on the bottom and sound notably hollow if there are any air pockets underneath them. I can hear that on quite a few of the existing tiles in my hallway and in my old living room. And I can say from experience that the tiles that sounded hollow also are trivially simple to pop up from the floor when I was receiving them. You can buy very finished looking Saltillo tiles, but mine are distinctly rustic looking. They have the multicolored hues and animal paw prints and all the rest. The appropriate grout width for this style of tile is very large, between 3/4 inch and 1 inch. This does make placing the tiles quite a bit easier than some other styles. You'll note that in my list of tools I made no mention of any kind of spacers. Well, that's because I just set the tile down roughly in line with the others and leave it be. There's no reason to measure anything or get any more precise than just it looking right. These wide spaces between tiles also mean that it's not as critically important to keep the tiles at the same level, since small variations will be imperceptible this far apart. I do use a level to roughly keep each individual tile from tilting too much, but nothing too crazy. Oh, I just noticed that this video doesn't show me spraying down the concrete slab before all this. That's what that spray bottle you see is for. I do that for the same reason that I soak the tiles beforehand, so the slab doesn't suck up any of the moisture from the thin set while it's curing. After setting the tile, I use a few pieces of wood I had lying around to clean out the grout lines. The sheer size of these pieces is probably somewhat unique to installing Saltillo. I'm also very quick to use the sponge to get rid of any thin set that fell on a tile. Even with the overnight soak, these tiles still have a tendency to stain if the thin set is left on for too long. But I'm not sure just how long that time is, so I just make sure it's removed ASAP. It took me just over a half hour to lay down roughly 10 feet of tile, or 21 individual tiles, both full and partial. I don't think that's very fast, but, well, I was able to do it before all the thin set actually started hardening, so mission accomplished. I then let it set for 24 hours before the grouting started. Saltillo is different enough that it has its own special grout mix. It's maybe hard to find most places, but not here in the Southwest. You can even find it at Home Depot, Lowe's, and all the other big box stores. In my case, I just used the leftover grout that the previous homeowner had left and mixed up a batch using the directions on the package. Grouting is tedious work even in the best of cases, and grouting Saltillo is not even close to the best of cases. I mean, it starts out pretty standard, as I just flood all of the joints with the grout mixture. The only real difference here is the sheer amount of grout needed. I mean, with typical tiles, you can get away with a little box of grout powder that makes a little bit of grout. But with grout joints this large, you need to get it in the 50-pound bags. The next step is also relatively standard in that I take out my rubber float and apply it at an angle to smooth out the joints. I then use the same rubber float, but now at a 90-degree angle, to essentially squeegee off as much of the grout from the surface of the tile as I can. This would almost be a meditative step if I didn't know what was coming next. See, the final step is to finish the cleaning and grout shaping process using a sponge. Sounds simple, right? Well, the actual motions and such are simple, but for whatever reason, this step takes forever. These few tiles that you see before you took about 10 minutes to finalize, with my back killing me the entire time. See, it's super important to get it all off. With typical grouting, you essentially leave a very thin layer on it that forms a haze overnight. You then remove that haze the next day. Well, you can't leave any grout on Saltillo, since that haze will be impossible to remove without chemical means if it's allowed to stay on overnight. So yeah, it is possible to actually remove it. There's a compound out there that I came across that will do it, some kind of acid. But who wants to deal with that? So yeah, every square inch of the tile must be meticulously cleaned so it's absolutely pristine. Oh, tedious. When it's all done, the grout is notably dark, and I'll have to say I don't mind the look of it at all. When it dries though, it dries to a much lighter tone of gray. Not quite as much of a fan of it. You'll also note that the gray is similar to the grout color for the rest of the hull, but it's not exact. That's because the existing grout is actually painted a lighter color than it would naturally be. See, the originally installed tile wasn't sealed, and so the grout became permanently stained. No amount of scrubbing could clean it off. Therefore, a year or so ago, we got this Polyblend Renew Grout, Colorant, and Sealer, and went to town painting the grout. In order to match the existing grout then, I needed to apply that same colorant to the new grout. Now this is all 1 week after it's installed, so I gave the grout time to fully cure. Using the Polyblend colorant is straightforward, if very exacting. I start by pouring out a very tiny line directly onto the grout. A little bit of this goes a long way, and pouring too much will just make cleanup that much harder later. The actual painting step utilizes an old toothbrush. Yes, that's literally what is recommended on the bottle. The old toothbrush has fine enough bristles to really get up close to the tile edge without sloppily going over. My technique is to drag the paint down the middle of the grout to essentially load an entire section. Then I super carefully bring the paint out to the edges, being very aware of where every single bristle is on the toothbrush. It's very zen-like. Go extremely slow. Doing just these 21 tiles ended up taking a full day. It actually took multiple days to do the entire hallway the first time around. Yeah, super slow going. Even being super careful though, there is bound to be a few tiny areas where the colorant spills over. I used a wet paper towel to essentially scrub it off. After it dries, you can see that there is still a color difference between the old and the new. Well, this is exactly the same colorant, same bottle even, so that color difference is just dirt. The Polyblend solution is both a colorant and a sealant, so in theory I can just scrub off the grime from the old grout to make it match. Sure enough, a solution of 50-50 vinegar and water and a little elbow grease, and the old and the new are indistinguishable. Sweet. If there's one overriding trait of Saltillo tiles that should be very clear from this video already, is that it stains extremely easily. That means that using a sealant that soaks in is an essential last step of all this. Applying the sealant is the easiest part of the entire process. I flood it on using a foam brush, but honestly anything at all that can evenly spread it out will work just fine. It doesn't take a lot either. It kind of has a greasy texture, but does soak in readily. In the case of the most porous tiles, I had like 2 of them. A couple coats was needed, but for the rest only 1 coat sufficed. After spreading it, I just wipe off the excess with a rag and voila, it's done. Yeah, really done this time after all of these steps. All in all, I'm glad I did it because now this part of the hall looks finished. If I was starting from scratch, yeah, there's no way I'd use Saltillo, so I don't really like the look of it. It's not fun to work with. But since it matches the existing tile, and I had almost everything needed to do the job already, it was the clear choice. I'm gratified to see that it looks like the tiles have always been there at least. And thanks for watching.